by NASCAR, and that the race would be held 475 days from today on February the 22nd, 1959. And you know what it was? The track included 31-degree turns, a D-shaped front straight, and a 3,000-foot back straightaway. It was wide and fast, and it was made for those looking for competition and speed. Cotton Owens was the top qualifier for the inaugural running of the Daytona 500 in 1959 with a speed of 143 miles per hour, proving that the Speedway was not for the faint of heart. 59 cars started the race, but only 3 were a part of the dramatic finish: Lee Petty, Johnny Beauchamp, and Joe Weatherly. It took officials 3 days of studying still photography and video footage before Petty was determined the winner. Race fans know that Daytona Beach has more to offer than just the Daytona 500. Daytona International Speedway also hosts several other high-profile events, such as the Pepsi 400 and Speed Weeks. Speed Weeks has gained much attention as a 2-week racing event held each February. The annual series of events kicks off with the Rolex 24, a 24-hour sports car race of endurance, followed by Bud Pole qualifying, the Bud Shootout, the Automobile Racing Club of America race, and twin 125-mile qualifying races. The 2-week event wraps up with the NASCAR Craftsman Truck and NASCAR Busch Series. Then finally, the granddaddy of them all, the Daytona 500. It's a great 2 weeks of racing.
Lowe's Motor Speedway.
Lowe's Motor Speedway, originally the Charlotte Motor Speedway, began a troublesome construction in July of 1959. While under construction, co-founders Curtis Turner and Bruton Smith ran into trouble, not only financially, but also with the weather conditions and timing issues. Smith and Turner ran into cost overruns because of huge boulders construction crews encountered while trying to do the grade and drain work at the site, some 20 miles northeast of Charlotte in neighboring Cabarrus County. As Turner and Smith worked fast and furious to complete the track, they were struck with an idea. Wanting to offer the fans more and a good test for the race teams, what if they made the race 600 miles instead of the traditional 500? The first race was held June 19, 1960. It was named the World 600. Construction had continued right through time trials and caused the teams to make last-minute modifications to their cars. Deflectors were added to the hoods of the cars to keep the flying asphalt away from the windshield, while wire grates were installed to protect the radiators. Despite the rough track conditions, 6 cars took the starting flag. After 5.5 hours of racing, Joe Lee Johnson was declared the winner. Things have definitely improved at the Speedway since that inaugural day. Drivers have become more accustomed to the track conditions, with pole speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour. Over 100,000 fans now pack the seats that once held only 35,000, while skyboxes, condominiums, and office suites have been added around the track. In fact, many NASCAR drivers own condos overlooking the track and enjoy being home for a couple race weekends a year.
Talladega Super Speedway.
Bill France headed the construction of this larger version of his Daytona International Speedway on the site of an Army air base and opened the track in 1969, calling it Alabama International Motor Speedway. At the inaugural Super Speedway event, Charlie Glochbach set a record with the fastest lap in stock car history when he ran 199 miles per hour during the time trials. Richard Brickhouse, who then drove Glochbach's car for the inaugural race, won the event. Even though it was Brickhouse's one and only victory, it put him in the ranks with other legendary drivers that had been inaugural winners at speedways such as Darlington, Atlanta, and MIS. One of the greatest drivers of all time, Dale Earnhardt, accomplished a feat that only 4 drivers have achieved. He swept both races during a single season at Talladega. 2 of Earnhardt's wins were captured in 1990, with 2 more in the 1999 season. The 3 other drivers to earn this mark were Pete Hamilton in 1970, Buddy Baker in 1975, and D.W. Darrell Waltrip in 1982. One of the more recent changes at the track came in 1987 with the announcement that all competitive engines would require carburetor restrictor plates for safety.
NASCAR's greatest drivers. Bobby Allison.
As the 1988 Daytona 500 thundered toward its conclusion, Bobby Allison led the way in his Miller Beer-sponsored Buick. On his heels was the white and black Texaco Haviland Ford Thunderbird driven by his son, Davey. Father and son took the checkered flag in that order, Bobby just a fraction of a second ahead. Not only was it the first father-son 1-2 finish in NASCAR Winston Cup racing in 28 years, it was the first victory ever scored by a driver in his 50s. Allison, a two-time winner of the 500, turned 50 a little more than 2 months before he got his third win in the Daytona Classic. Just 4 months later, though, one of NASCAR's greatest careers would be finished. Allison was injured in a crash on June 19, 1988 at Pocono Raceway, and it took years before he recovered and returned to the scene as a team owner. Even tougher blows for Allison were in store. Davey Allison was destined to die from injuries suffered in a helicopter crash in July 1993, not quite a year after his younger brother Clifford was lost in a crash during practice at Michigan International Speedway. Those tragedies were much more trying than any of the tribulations Allison had endured. But if any driver had a star-crossed career, it was him. Allison finished second in driver point standings 5 times before finally claiming a title of his own in 1983. The Miami-born driver called his own shots and stood on his own principles, several times severing relationships with well-funded teams to drive his own equipment and never hesitating to speak his mind or back down in any other way from confrontation. Along the way, he rolled up 84 victories, tying him third all-time with Darrell Waltrip, and won a legion of fans. Allison is honored in numerous shrines, including the National Motorsports Press Association and International Motorsports Halls of Fame.
Dale Earnhardt.
NASCAR racing has had many stars over the more than 50 years of its history, but it can be stated with certainty that none compares to Dale Earnhardt. The loss of Earnhardt in an accident on the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500 had worldwide repercussions. The famous Intimidator and his black number 3 Goodwrench Chevrolet transcended mere regional or national recognition. He was more than his 7 championships and 76 race victories, more than his Brickyard 400, long-awaited Daytona 500, and other major race triumphs. He was a polarizing figure about whom few were ambivalent. Many worshipped him, some didn't, but all respected him. Fans and detractors alike were motivated by the attributes Earnhardt displayed, of fierce competitiveness, a visage that was sometimes menacing, sometimes playfully charming, a talent for driving race cars that was beyond any and all debate. He was the personification of NASCAR racing and a significantly symbolic singular representative of his sport. 2 years after Earnhardt's loss, NASCAR racing goes on, bigger than ever. Whatever NASCAR racing will be in the new century, it will be built on the lofty level to which Earnhardt helped lift it in his years of racing.
Bill Elliott.
To those who thought Bill Elliott was over the hill, who believed the 2001 season-ending victory at Homestead Miami Speedway was a fluke, who thought Ray Evernham was nuts to name Elliott the centerpiece of his new Dodge racing team, guess again. Awesome Bill is awesome still. It should be pointed out that even among those who had such negative thoughts about the status of his career, a good many remained fans of Elliott. Through the depths of a 7-year winless streak, through times when even Elliott questioned his desire, if not his abilities, the redhead from Dawsonville, Georgia, remained the consistent pick as NASCAR's most popular driver. And he proved in 2002 that he hasn't forgotten how to win. Elliott scored back-to-back victories, pushing his career total to 43. More significant was the decisive manner in which he won the races. And most noteworthy of all was that he added his name to the list of winners of the Brickyard 400 at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Gordon, Earnhardt, Jarrett, Rudd, Labonte, and now Elliott. The emotional post-race reaction by Elliott underscored how important a brickyard victory is to NASCAR's elite. Elliott already had a resume filled with victories in races such as the Daytona 500, Winston 500, the Southern 500, and others. But he was overjoyed to take the checkered flag at Indy. Young drivers are rising to the forefront, and Elliott is not the only veteran driver looking over his shoulder, but he takes it in stride. In recent years, Elliott, who holds the NASCAR all-time qualifying speed record with a little over 212 mile-per-hour laps at Talladega in 1987, has rediscovered his short-track roots and enjoys racing a dirt late-model stock car when time permits. That, along with the comfort level he has reached in working with Evernham, make this the best of times for the fastest man in NASCAR history.
Tim Flock.
Tim Flock opened the 1952 season by leading every lap of a 100-mile race January the 20th at the half-mile dirt Palm Beach Speedway in Florida. 10 months later, he flipped his Ted Chester-owned Hudson out of the ballpark in the season finale at the same track. Despite the spectacular crash, Flock finished 12th and clinched the championship title in what is now the NASCAR Winston Cup Series. Now, things were never dull around Flock, who competed in 1953 in several races with a passenger, a rhesus monkey named Jocko Flacco, outfitted in a racing suit with goggles and strapped into a special seat in Flock's race car. Through it all, though, Flock was one of the most successful competitors in the first decade of NASCAR history. He was the second two-time champion, romping to the 1955 crown by winning a record 18 races, 18 poles, and $33,750 and 39 starts. He also won 11 races from the pole, led every lap in 10 races, and led the most laps in 19 races. Flock would miss 11 races during the 1953 season, but not because of any monkey business. It was while he recuperated from head injuries suffered in a freak accident on July 4th when a car backed over Flock's head while he napped in the infield of the Piedmont Interstate Fairgrounds dirt track in Spartanburg, South Carolina. There were other periods when Flock was missing from NASCAR action. He missed 7 months of the 1954 season after he quit in anger over a disqualification that took victory away from him in February at Daytona. And he quit his job with one of the most successful teams in NASCAR history, the Kiefer Chrysler operation, in the midst of the 1956 season. Flock's career ended in 1961, just as the sport was beginning its ascent to mainstream popularity in America.
Jeff Gordon.
He had an uncharacteristic slump and extended streak without a victory early in 2002. And as the season progressed towards its conclusion, he failed to defend his 2001 NASCAR Winston Cup Championship title. But Jeff Gordon is still king of the mountain as NASCAR racing roars on into the new century. Not many drivers would consider a season with 3 victories and a top 5 points finish a bad season, but for someone with a resume like Gordon's, a performance like 2002 was a bit of a letdown. The year before, when Gordon claimed his 4th championship, he joined an elite group of drivers who have won more than 3 titles. The group includes only 7-time champs Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt and Gordon. The 4th title represented a comeback of sorts for Gordon, who had won only 10 races the past 2 seasons and finished a mere 6th and 9th in driver points in 1999 and 2000. Those performances, excellent by most standards, happened to come on the heels of a 4-year romp in which Gordon won 40 of 127 races and 3 of 4 championships. Gordon earned his first championship the hard way in 1995, edging Earnhardt, who was trying to win a record 8th title and 5th in 6 years. The 8th championship would elude Earnhardt, while Gordon, after finishing 2nd in 1996, rose to the undisputed top of the heap in the second half of the decade. He forever left behind the nickname Earnhardt bestowed upon him, Wonder Boy, when Gordon arrived in NASCAR as a fresh-faced youngster with tremendous expectations. The nickname was intended to aggravate Gordon, and it did get under his skin until Gordon celebrated his first championship by toasting Earnhardt with a champagne glass full of milk. From that moment on, They were peers with different personalities and from different generations, but classic sports rivals with a mutual respect for each other.
Dale Jarrett.
After coming close 4 years in a row, third in 1995, 96, and 98, and second in 1997, Dale Jarrett captured the NASCAR Winston Cup Championship in 1999. It put Jarrett in the company of 23 drivers who had won NASCAR's big title. The list included Jarrett's father, Ned, who won in 1961 and again in 65. The Jarretts joined Lee and Richard Petty in a very exclusive club, his father-son champions. It was a long-awaited first title for Jarrett's car owner, Robert Yates, who had fielded some of the best cars on the circuit for more than a decade. En route to his title, Jarrett won 4 races and failed to finish only 1 race. That level of performance proved hard to maintain for Jarrett and the Yates team. In 2002, driving the UPS-sponsored number 88 Ford, Jarrett slipped to 9th out of the top 5 in points for the first time since 1994. But he did win 2 races, pushing his career total to 30 and turning in one of the best performances by a 40-something driver in a year dominated by young rising stars. Jarrett never enjoyed such status as an aspiring driver. He worked his way through the ranks and got his big break in 1990 when he was picked to replace the injured Neil Bonnet in the Wood Brothers Ford. He won his first race at Michigan in 1991 in a door-to-door battle with Davey Allison. That win set the tone for Jarrett, who went on to prove himself one of NASCAR's top clutch performers in race-deciding showdowns with top competitors. He also proved capable in the more illustrious races on the schedule. He has won 3 Daytona 500s and 2 Brickyard 400s, all of which suggests that the best is not necessarily in the past for Jarrett. He returned for his 9th season with Yates in 2003.
Richard Petty.
It can be argued that no driver played a more important role in laying down the foundation for modern NASCAR racing than Richard Petty. Petty, often compared to golfer Arnold Palmer, rose to stardom as stock car racing began to move into national prominence in the 1960s and 70s. Just as Palmer had Jack Nicklaus for a rival, Petty had David Pearson. The two battled each other for supremacy and helped build each other's legend. Petty is the elder son of 3-time champion Lee Petty, winner of the inaugural Daytona 500 in 1959. He emerged from a considerable shadow. Richard Petty was more than a prodigious winner. He was also an affable ambassador, a fast-driving version of Sheriff Andy Taylor of Mayberry. He helped change the image of race car drivers from greasy hoodlums to good citizens with great potential as corporate spokesmen. In 1964, Petty won the first of 7 Daytona 500 victories. He went on that year to win the first of 7 NASCAR Winston Cup Championship titles, launching his career in a time when the schedule included as many as 60 races a year. Petty competed in nearly all the events and won a phenomenal 200 times. In 1967, he won a series record 27 of 48 races, including a streak of 10 in a row. Petty scored his 200th and final career victory at Daytona on July 4th, 1984, winning a stirring duel by inches over Cale Yarborough in a side-by-side finish. President Ronald Reagan was watching from the press box and met Petty after the race. Petty retired 8 seasons later. Tragedy struck the Petty family in 2000. Patriarch Lee passed away at age 86, and the family's 4th-generation driver, 19-year-old Adam Petty, was lost in a racing accident just a month after his great-grandfather's death. Kyle Petty, Richard's son and winner of 8 races in his own driving career, keeps the Petty Enterprises operation going more than a half-century after it was established.
Darrell Waltrip.
When Darrell Waltrip broke into NASCAR Winston Cup racing in 1972, he didn't sneak in unnoticed. In fact, his demeanor was similar to that of another Kentuckian who made quite a splash in the sports world, Muhammad Ali. Waltrip may have never proclaimed, "I'm the greatest," But he definitely shook up the world, the NASCAR world anyway, with his outspoken manner and his considerable driving talent. About the talent, there could be little debate. Waltrip quickly showed the ability that would carry him to 3 championship titles and 84 victories. Major victories include 5 Coca-Cola 600s and a long-awaited Daytona 500 and Southern 500 triumphs. Waltrip was the first winner of the Winston, NASCAR's All-Star race in 1985. About the sharp tongue, there was considerable discussion. Veteran Cale Yarborough nicknamed Waltrip Jaws in a reference to the popular movie about a man eating great white shark and Waltrip's propensity to bite chunks out of competitors' egos with his verbal outbursts. It was mostly all bark and, well, no bite. Waltrip was a clean, fair competitor who was more than willing to mix it up in spirited competition, but never developed a reputation as a dirty driver. And in May 1989, when a bump from Rusty Wallace sent Waltrip spinning out of the lead in the Winston, fans who had previously booed old DW suddenly saw him as the good guy, and his popularity soared. Waltrip helped establish the DeGard team as a contender, winning 26 races in Gatorade-sponsored cars, and drove for some of NASCAR's most successful car owners, including Rick Hendrick. But he had his greatest success in a 6-year stint with the legendary Junior Johnson, winning all 3 championship titles in Johnson's cars. Waltrip got the last of his career victories September 6, 1992, in the Southern 500. He closed out his career in 2000 and moved into the television booth as an analyst for Fox.
Joe Weatherly.
Fun-loving, practical-joking, hyper-superstitious Joe Weatherly was the life of the party. But he was something to admire, not a joke when he climbed into the cockpit of a race car. Weatherly, as his 24 victories and 2 championships attest, was a plenty serious racer. He just never let it get in the way of a good time. Weatherly won 3 national motorcycle racing titles before switching to stock cars in 1951, and he won NASCAR's National Modified Championship in 1953. He competed in 111 races in the convertible division, winning 13, and he began dabbling in the Premier Series, now known as NASCAR Winston Cup, in 1952. He didn't get his first win on the senior circuit until 1960 at Hickory, North Carolina, driving a Holman Moody Ford in his 61st start. Then he won his 2nd straight race the next night at Wilson, North Carolina, and made it 3 out of 4 with a victory in the Rebel 300 at Darlington. Weatherly won 9 races in each of the next 2 seasons and captured the series championship in 1962. He became the 3rd driver to win back-to-back titles when he repeated in 1963, even though he had won only 3 races in his 2nd championship year. The sidekick of Curtis Pops Turner, Little Joe, was a master dirt track racer, but he also showed excellence on larger, faster paved speedways. He had 3 top 5 finishes in the 5 Daytona 500s in which he competed, including a 2nd in 1961, and also won qualifying races at Daytona in 1961 and 62. He had big track victories at Darlington and Charlotte. Going after an unprecedented 3rd straight title, Weatherly suffered fatal injuries when his Bud Moore Mercury crashed into the Turn 6 wall on the 87th lap of the Motor Trend 500 January 19, 1964 at Riverside International Raceway.
Cale Yarborough.
As a youngster, he would sneak in and watch in awe as stock cars roared around Darlington Raceway, not far from his Sardis, South Carolina home. Not too many years later, as an 18-year-old, Cale Yarborough would compete in his first race, the 8th annual Southern 500 at the Darlington track on Labor Day 1957. Yarborough would go on to win the famous race 5 times. He would also win the Daytona 500 4 times and 83 races in all, 5th best overall, and he would become the first and, so far, only driver to win the NASCAR Winston Cup Championship 3 years in a row. Now, impressive as they are, numbers are not always enough to tell the story of Yarborough, one of the sport's all-time best and toughest competitors, sufficiently talented to compete well into modern times, but with the mindset of the hard-charging drivers of the sport's early days. He was a seat-of-the-pants racer whose objectives were simple and straightforward: win the pole, lead every lap, win the race. His philosophy was the same on a half-mile dirt bull ring or on a super speedway at 200 miles an hour. Before he could reach the peak of his career as a NASCAR driver, Yarbrough ventured into IndyCar racing. He competed in the famous Indianapolis 500 4 times, finishing 10th in his 4th start in 1972. The next year, Yarbrough returned to NASCAR to drive for the legendary Junior Johnson. In 8 seasons, Yarbrough won 55 victories and scored the trio of championships in 1976, 77, and 78. He logged 2 10-win seasons and won 9 races in 2 other years. Yarbrough set up his own race team in 1987. After retiring as a driver in 1988, he hired rising star Dale Jarrett, and in 1997, John Andretti gave Yarbrough a victory as a team owner in the Pepsi 400 at Daytona.
NASCAR's greatest families. The Allisons.
Perhaps no family in NASCAR has ever seen more tragedy amid their triumphs than the Allisons, whose elder members helped create that notorious band of highly successful drivers known as the Alabama Gang. Bobby and Donnie Allison loved to race. Bobby, who had wanted to be a driver ever since witnessing his first stock car event as a kid, started while still in high school at tracks in the Miami area. Bobby raced under an assumed name to keep his avocation secret. He won his first race in the amateur division at Hialeah Speedway, earning a whopping $12. Although the purse wasn't much, Bobby knew he had found his calling. After convincing his parents to let him continue racing, no small feat, Bobby set out to make his name in racing, taking every opportunity to compete at the local tracks. Before long, Donnie joined in. Then one day, Bobby and Donnie traveled to Alabama to try out the tracks there and came home with more money than they'd ever seen from the Florida tracks. Excited about the endless possibilities, they convinced a longtime friend, Red Farmer, to go back with them, and the success that followed is legendary. Hueytown, west of Birmingham, became the family's adopted home, and racing's Alabama Gang was born. During that time, there were many races where the Allisons and Farmer would end up taking first, second, and third place. Local competitors around the Mid-South would see the 3 cars being hauled in the gate and start grumbling. There comes that Alabama Gang again, and a nickname was born. The late 60s and early 70s were very good to Donnie Allison. In 1967, during Donnie's first full year of racing, he took 4 of top 5 and 7 top 10s to capture NASCAR Rookie of the Year honors. During a 5-year stretch, Donnie started 71 races and came away with 6 wins and 34 top 5 finishes. And being the competitive driver that he was, Donnie drove in both open wheel and stock car events. In May 1970, he finished 4th in the Indianapolis 500 and a few days later won the World 600 at Charlotte. Bobby also tried his hand at Indy, but he concentrated mainly on stock cars. He is tied for 3rd on the all-time list with 84 Winston Cup victories, and he holds one record that may never be broken. He held the lead at least once in 39 consecutive races. His battles on the track with Richard Petty provided some of the most captivating racing the sport has ever seen. In the early 1980s, another classic feud developed in NASCAR's history, this time between Bobby and Darrell Waltrip. Up to this point, Bobby had never won the NASCAR Winston Cup Series championship, and in 1981 he was determined to do so. Bobby seemed to be on his way that year, but a late season charge by Waltrip spoiled his hopes. Then in 1982, the same thing happened, and Waltrip again won with a late season rally. For the 2nd year in a row, and the 4th time since 1972, Allison was 2nd. In 1983, Allison finally captured the prize he'd always wanted, a Winston Cup championship. Prior to Bobby's championship, another Allison was beginning to make his presence known. Davey Allison, Bobby's son, had always wanted to follow the path of his father. His career really started when he began working in his father's shop, learning the ins and outs of cars and driving in various local races. Davy's break came shortly after he began driving in limited sportsman events. Frustrated with his nephew's uphill battle to field a quality car, Donnie supplied Davy with a Chevy Nova frame that he could really build upon. The results were immediate. Davy assembled his new car and then won the first 2 races he entered. Now there was a new gang in town, the Peach Fuzz Gang, comprised of Davy and his boyhood friends. With a good ride and a crew of his own, and under the direction of his grandfather, Edmund "Pop" Allison, Davy started to tear up the ARCA circuit and make his own splash in the NASCAR Winston Cup Series. Winning 4 ARCA races in 1983 and taking home the ARCA Rookie of the Year honors in 1984, Davy substituted in 3 NASCAR Winston Cup Series events in 1985 and grabbed a top 10 finish on his way to the show. In 1987, Davy Allison qualified on the front row of the Daytona 500, the first rookie to accomplish that feat. 2 months later, Davy won his first NASCAR Winston Cup Series race at Talladega. By the end of his rookie season, Davy had won 2 races, earned 5 poles, taken 9 top 5s, and earned the Ray Bestis Rookie of the Year award. The 1988 Daytona 500 is memorable for several reasons, including a spectacular crash that the legendary Petty survived with only minor injuries. It was special for